during that time, we would go school to school and I would talk to people, and there would be a lot of variation in how successful the school was and how much the people who had these sort of informal or formalized leadership roles could enact them. And the response I kept getting from people was, this school is working because Jennie is good with people. And this isn't working because Stephanie is not as skilled with people. And while that might be partially true, you can't go to scale on personality. So if your model is contingent on one person being good or bad with people, then you don't really have a model. You don't really have a reform. You don't really have a systems-based way of helping schools get better.
Welcome to the Teaming Edge, a show about education leaders and the actions they take to support team and school performance. In today's show, Dr. Jennie Weiner, Associate Professor of Educational Leadership at the University of Connecticut Neeg School of Education, author, and an expert on issues of women, education, and care work, will share her insights on local school instructional leadership teams. In this episode, Dr. Jennie Weiner will discuss insights from her research done on instructional leadership teams. Instructional leadership teams, which began in the 80s, attempts to, quote, facilitate collaborative decision-making focused on both instruction and school governance issues, unquote. However, the dynamics on an ILT and the results they get is mixed and depends on a variety of factors such as membership criteria and professional norms. First, let's hear how Jennie started her work in the field of education.
So I started my career as a middle school and high school teacher, and I loved it. I loved teaching. I loved being in a school. I loved everything about it, except for being the only new teacher in a school that was fairly traditional in its orientation. So never had an induction, never had anybody come into my classroom, didn't really know what I was doing, like probably many new teachers. And I was frustrated by that. I also felt that my students often got very different messages about who they are, the purpose of schooling, of what we were doing together, community, so on and so forth, depending on what day they had and who they would interact with.
After teaching 7th and 11th grade history, Jennie went back to school to get her master's at Harvard Graduate School of Education.
It was right about the time of No Child Left Behind. Things were happening in scale that had never happened before. One of my professors was really deeply involved in the 1993 reform bill in Massachusetts and the subsequent policy reform. So because of that, it just totally blew the lid off in terms of how I was thinking. So instead of one school, I was thinking about schools as systems and organizations and how to facilitate more like structural change across schools.
Jennie then worked for the National School Reform Program and was deeply involved in rethinking teacher trajectories in terms of leadership and building internal capacities.
During that time, we would go school to school and I would talk to people, and there would be a lot of variation in how successful the school was and how much the people who had these sort of informal or formalized leadership roles could enact them. And the response I kept getting from people was like, this school is working because Jennie is good with people, and they're responding to her more positively. And this isn't working because Stephanie is not as skilled with people, and therefore that's why this PLC sort of teacher leadership-based model isn't working. And while that might be partially true, you can't go to scale on personality. So if your model is contingent on one person being good or bad with people, then you don't really have a model. You don't really have a reform. You don't really have a systems-based way of helping schools get better. And so I was very dissatisfied with that as an answer to the problem that I saw, which is good intention, structures that are meant to support shared leadership and improvement, but high levels of variation.
At this point, Jennie gets her doctorate at Harvard Graduate School of Education and defended her dissertation investigating instructional leadership teams in action.
And then became very interested in both reframing how we think about leadership. So like away from one person to think about it as a collection of activities that we create systems and structures to engage other people in their best work. And then two, asking a lot of questions about why we are so interested as a field in reinforcing ideas about one great person telling us what to do to make systems better.
Today, Jennie has written over 40 peer-reviewed journals on gender, race, and leadership, educator professionalism and practice, teacher leadership in teams, and organizational improvement, culture, and policy. Jennie has also written her first book with Dr. Isabel Stevenson, The Strategy Playbook for Educational Leaders, Principles and Processes, which provides a concrete framework for a strategic improvement plan helping educators link the principles to the processes of planning. In addition to her book, I was particularly drawn to Jennie's 2014 article published in the Journal of Education Change entitled Disabling Conditions, Investigating Instructional Leadership Teams in Action. This article found that instructional leadership teams tended to be formed based on having broad representation. So in other words, ensuring that the ILT had representation from grade levels, departments, content areas, special ed, etc. So here I asked Jennie to tell us about how purpose and membership are not always aligned and the benefits of having clear membership criteria based on a team's purpose.
I do want to give credit where credit is due to begin, which is in the work of Richard Hackman, who wrote a book called Leading Teams. The major argument that he makes, as does Ruth Wackerman and other colleagues, is that you can't fix with coaching poor structure. And they have good evidence to suggest that. So what is the good structure? Well, they talk about this idea of enabling conditions. And some of the enabling conditions, which I think you brought up here, is having the right people on the team. So the question, of course, is who are the right people? So one of the issues, as you said so eloquently, that I noticed and I've seen, again, ubiquitously across schools, is that in an effort to do something around what I would say is to make the ILT politically palatable, there is a sense that we need representation from everywhere in the school. And I totally understand that instinct. The question, of course, is whether or not representation should trump other features of individuals. So in the case of my study, what often happened was they were desperate, or they kind of put that as a superordinate idea. And so even if there was nobody from, let's say, the history department or the science department who was more veteran or successful, they would say, well, this is the only person left in that particular department. They happen to be a new teacher in their third month of teaching, but they should be on the ILT. In fact, that happened in multiple spaces. So, of course, the problem with that is not the intent. The intent is to be representative. But if the goal of the ILT is meant to function primarily to improve practice and support the learning and growing of teachers across the school, putting the weight of that on a 3-month-in teacher feels kind of funny. But again, I think that, to your point, we have to have the sense of matching. So what does that tell me? It tells me that potentially the clarity about what the team's function should be or purpose is may not be terribly clear, right? Because if in fact, it seems simple to step away and say, well, if we want the best possible instruction to support movement and growth, we want our best instructors, or at least people who are capable of having metacognition and sharing good practice or knowing where to look to find it. But if we're doing representation, then that suggests to me that the function or the purpose might be more oriented towards political performance, that we are allowing voices, but not necessarily what the substance of those voices might be. But I think what I'm trying to offer is it's very important to situate and discuss what you want your function and form to be, and then choose people based on the criteria of what you're hoping to achieve, rather than saying, we're having a team, it needs to be representative, let's get all those people in the room, and then we'll try to figure out what the heck we're supposed to be doing.
Otherwise, you're going to have competing commitments and competing actions that are not supporting each other. And then I also noticed that in your research, an unintended consequence is this competition that comes out on these teams as a result of representation rather than...
That's right. If the purpose of the team is unclear, like we're supposed to improve the school, let's say, or we're making it better for everyone, which of course is nice. It's not poor intent. It's just not terribly clear. And then I see that all of the representatives come from each department. And I know that the decisions we make have to do about resource allocation potentially, or access to resources. If there's a choice between a curriculum that's going to expend more energy and time, but support my interests versus your interests, it's likely that I'm going to feel that I need to protect my own, right? Which is quite different than saying we have chosen a instructional goal that cross-cuts all of the departments, all of the things in the school. For example, we might say, I'm not a huge fan, but often people are saying we want to improve rigor, let's say, whatever that means. But at least we could all agree that's something that each of us could benefit from, not whether or not I'm going to detract a certain amount of time from the school day and then the specialists get, the shaft. Of course, as if I'm a specialist and I'm in the room, I'm like, I don't care what the intervention is. I already have barely any time to be with the students. I don't want to give up my time to benefit somebody else or vice versa.
It is a normal, natural, necessary response to want to protect your resources.
100%, particularly given that schools are often under rather than over-resourced, right? So it would be different if we had more than enough, but it never feels that way. And so I think what it does, that combined with what the people there think they're there to do, creates less real teaming and more sort of a collection of individuals who happen to be in a room together, having a discussion potentially about the same topic. I mean, one of the things that Hackman talks about that's really key to teaming and something I don't think we often discuss is that the work needs to be interdependent. All of us there giving our individuals' constituencies needs is not the same as us all holding the same problem together and saying, how can we each collectively contribute to addressing, solving, better understanding this problem?
And that would start with having a shared purpose.
Exactly.
A trend in education over the past few years has been this, speaking of shared purpose, is shared leadership or distributed leadership, as you referred to it. So one critical action of shared leadership would be shared decision-making among stakeholders of a particular group. So you found in your research that although principals had an espoused belief in shared leadership, their actions would often undermine ILT's ability to make decisions or have the authority to make decisions. Tell us about that.
Sure. So I think, again, this is something that we don't really talk about, right? We can put people in a room and give them an hour together, but that is not a team. And so Ruth Ragaman and Richard Hackman, again, speak about the different forms or functions a team can have. One is purely informational. So you can imagine going around and everybody reporting out what they've been up to. This is not a bad thing for groups of people to do, but they're just there to share information. The second would be sort of consultative, which is, I have a decision I have to make. Could you give me some information about that? Which I think happens most frequently, where it's clear that the principal is sort of the one who's going to inevitably make the decision. We call it shared decision making, but in fact, the person who's making the decision is the administrator in that space. And then you have coordinating, which is sort of like, I've made the decision, here's a bunch of resources. Interdependently, can you solve this problem in situ? But you really haven't made a decision. You're just enacting the decision that's already been made. And then there's decision making, which is actually you've been empowered to make the decision. And the research says that when people are actually empowered as a collective to make decisions, you get the most efficiency, effectiveness, buy-in, likelihood that implementation is going to actually happen. But it's really hard to go from a system that really favors a more autocratic principal who's supposed to make strong decision and inevitably is probably the only person who's really going to be held accountable for those decisions, to say, like, you know what, trust that you can make joint decisions. And so what ends up happening is there's things like information hoarding, where the principal will say, you all make the decision, then they leave, they have something else they need to do. They come back, the team says, we worked for 3 hours, we made this decision, and the principal says, that's not in the budget.
You spoke to it so well in your research, the idea of professional norms. You could change a principal's perspective or belief around this, but the teachers may have a deeply embedded operating system around norms.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. One way to think about what one might indicate or feel is difficult behavior. I'm going to tell another story and I'll kind of apply it. So I often will go and meet with district leaders and principals, and they will complain that teachers, so where I am, they have SLOs, which is student learning objectives, which they have to set themselves, which are part of their evaluation process. I don't know if that's true where other listeners are, but they set what their targets are, and by the end of the year, they hope to achieve them, and that goes into their evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
And principals speak to me about their frustration that teachers tend to set those fairly low, meaning they set them so they can achieve them. They do not reach out towards higher levels of goals. And they get angry. They're sort of like, why won't the teachers do this? They should be innovative, and so on and so forth. Except they get paid and evaluated based on whether or not they make those goals. So they're not actually acting difficultly, like chaotically or something.
Right.
What they're doing is they're making rational decisions based on the structures of the system.
Yeah.
People are going to do things that make sense given the incentives and the structures of the system. So let's go back to the principal. If you're a principal and your district calls you any day at any time and demands all sorts of things from you, regardless of whether or not they actually support instructional leadership and continuous improvement in your school, you're being told that under, for example, turnaround, all of the choices for turnaround included firing the principal.
Just for our listeners, could you define turnaround?
Sure. I'm using it in the term from Race to the Top.
Yep.
As a policy initiative that when schools were identified as chronically underperforming, there were a multitude of choices, like large-scale reform the school. One was to fire 2/3 of the teacher and the principal. Another was where they had to engage in a variety of reform efforts. Another was closure, and another was to become a charter school. But in all those four, the principal gets fired. So there is a higher sense of accountability. You have these kind of infrastructure and incentive structures that do not promote the principals sharing decision-making with teachers and vice versa. Like you have all these norms and structures that tell teachers you're better off going and doing your thing and closing the door than you are exposing yourself, exposing your practice, putting yourself up for scrutiny. And then we get mad at them for behaving aligned with those systems and structures. We can't just plop in ILTs or PLCs or teacher leadership roles without attending to norms, systems, structures, incentives, unless we just want to have fake teams, which is what I found, right? Like my spoiler was instructional leadership teams don't look at instruction and they're not really teams.
Is it true that if you are fostering psychological safety, yet we're still operating under more traditional norms, it's not enough? So what's the relationship then with the idea of psychological safety and these norms?
It kind of depends how you conceptualize it. So if you think of it as just people feeling comfortable, then you're absolutely right. It wouldn't be enough. Feeling safe and being pushed are not the same. The whole purpose of psychological safety is situated in the idea of learning. Like Vygotsky, there's a zone of proximal development.
Lev Semyonovich Vygotsky was a Soviet psychologist known for his work on psychological development in children. The zone of proximal development was the foundation for Vygotsky's theory of learning and development. The zone of proximal development lies at the intersection of what a learner knows and what a learner does not know. So the zone of proximal development is what a learner can do with guidance or in collaboration with others.
And we have to create the kind of culture and norms that people feel that they can be pushed without being broken, or they're pushed without falling off the cliff. And when you have systems with high levels of uncertainty and cultural norms that are potentially problematic towards learning, part of the learning that you're trying to achieve is breaking those norms. So there's a famous case, I know you know Amy Edmondson, but she has a case about Children's Hospital. And the whole idea is that their norms were much like schools. So I've written about this, comparing schools and hospital systems.
I will add this to the show notes, but the article is titled Understanding Psychological Safety in Healthcare and Education Organizations, a Comparative Perspective. and it was published in Research in Human Development in 2016.
The ideas are quite hierarchical, so they were having a lot of medical mistakes, which is normal, but in a children's hospital, you can imagine how that would be really problematic. And people would hide them, or they'd blame each other, or nurses were always blamed because they're lowest on the hierarchical structure. And they basically reinvented their structures. But the thing is, psychological safety can't exist unless you also attend to those structures, those systems. They had things like confidential reporting. They had ways of people coming together to talk to each other in new ways. So you have to kind of attend to both. I can't change the culture if I don't change the systems and the ones that are sort of the complementary systems. So for example, in a school, if I wanted my ILT to work appropriately, I may have to change other things to ensure that. For example, how people are selected to the team. If I have a system in which I always just pick people based on who is voluntold or whatever, or there's no transparency, those team members are never going to get the kind of respect and understanding beyond the group of 5 of them to the school to understand why they're doing this work and have the kind of trustworthiness or respect they might need to ensure others will listen to them. I might have to start thinking about other ways to build new systems so that I'm in fact really sharing leadership. I may have to learn how to engage with the district in a different way as the leader. I may have to say to the district, listen, I'm hearing you want me to share leadership. That means that I need space not to be interrupted if I'm having, or my agenda to be taken away or changed every day if you want me to be able to engage in this productive way.
The system is perfectly designed to get the results that we get. So we got to change the structures, processes, right, systems. So it sounds like you'd want to set up systems so that you are encouraged to engage in a behavior that's conducive to getting the results that we're looking for.
Exactly.
In order to get the results we want now, we have to make monumental, heroic efforts to circumvent obstacles in order to get what we want. So we want to really change those.
Yes. Another way of saying it is, I can't solve adaptive challenges with technical solutions. I can't say I need shared leadership, so here's an hour and some coffee and donuts and come and show up, right? Like I actually have to work to create structures to ensure conditions to allow this team to thrive.
You mentioned the idea of technical and adaptive routines. What's the difference, and what are the adaptive routines that would get us to what we're looking for here?
So I think a technical routine would be, it's team time. We just show up. We don't have an agenda. We don't really have a purpose. But I know that this is the ILT. No one's explicitly said it. I think an adaptive routine would be one in which you would foster, first of all, you'd have a sense of purpose. You would have rewards and incentives that match, that help us move towards that. And then I think you would have opportunities for continual renewal and movement towards double loop learning.
Okay, let me take a moment and describe this concept of double loop learning. So originally, the framework of single loop and double loop thinking was developed by Chris Ardress and Donald Shawn. Single loop learning is a response to the environment. There's very little learning that occurs. It's more of an automatic reaction. It addresses only the symptoms and does not get to the root cause. So we basically are modifying actions in order to reach an outcome. Now, double loop learning, on the other hand, is more reflective. We're thinking outside the box, and we're being creative, and we're thinking more critically. And we're also examining our own assumptions. So here, we'll modify actions based on our own assumptions, and this is going to allow us to address the root cause. Now, we can go one step further and look at triple loop learning, and this was first developed by a British social scientist by the name of Gregory Bateson, which describes learning how to learn. So this is a level of metacognition where we are modifying our actions and assumptions that lead to a modified framework. So let me summarize in this way. In single loop thinking, we might ask, are we doing things right? In double loop thinking, we might ask, are we doing the right things? And in triple loop thinking, we might ask, how do we decide what is right?
So the idea would be, we would question, why are we doing the thing that we're doing? And is the way we're doing it actually facilitating us getting to the result that we want? As opposed to, we have this much time, we have these 4 things on the agenda, let's finish them. And then next week we may do something related to this or not. It's completely sort of hara-kiri based on what's thrown at us any given week. I think the adaptive or the double loop is the idea that we don't end, right? We just continue through a cycle kind of improvement, but 2, that we're creating space to allow that to happen, which means we have to be able to make mistakes. We have to be thinking about how we're treating each other in space, the norms, ways of engaging, which again is quite different than just saying we're a team, because we're all sitting here and we gave it that name and here we are. If anybody's ever been in a situation where they're supposed to collaborate, when in fact you get there and then one person ends up holding all the work for the team, right? You fight a little bit and then somebody does that. And then people say, well, collaboration doesn't work. And you say, well, I haven't seen any, so I don't really know if it works or not.
So then you get to this idea of, well, we need to ensure that everyone has a voice. We need voice equity. But then I read your paper, I'm like, oh, there's voice equity, and then there's what you do with the voice.
I love that. Yeah, that's a great metaphor. I was actually just reading a really interesting paper about a school board and how they controlled rules about how much time they allow people to speak. So everybody got a voice, everybody could make a formal appointment, but then they cut people off. So one could say, wow, there was a real diversity of voices, but then the board just went in the other room, made the decision they were going to make anyway. I would argue that's a technical fix, right? Like, we've added a microphone, we created some time for people to say what they need to say, but it actually hasn't changed or reinvigorated our decision-making process in the slightest.
But if the process is in place where we're going to have shared leadership, shared decision-making, then attending to voice equity would be very powerful.
Exactly. I mean, the other thing about leadership teams, which people didn't do, which I think is really interesting. So this goes to this board meeting idea. We could have a core of decision makers or the ILT, and then we could ask people to join smaller teams as a working group. And then they could bring back what they've achieved, or we could deal with the representation problem by facilitating working groups that are like the spokes to the hub of the ILT. But then you'd actually have to coordinate them being in conversation with each other, which doesn't seem to happen that much in schools either.
What is the function of a PLC in relation to an ILT?
I've noticed oftentimes that the information is unidirectional, in the sense that I'm a member of my PLC. I'm also a member of the ILT because I represent my grade level. I go to the ILT gives directives, then I tell the PLC what the directives were. Then they complain. We've either decided how we're going to work around them, or we're going to figure out a way to kind of talk back. But oftentimes that doesn't change the trajectory. So that's my noticing how it often looks.
That rings true for me as well, yes.
Okay. I think the way it potentially could, so when you think about roles, we also don't need to think about them totally formally, in the sense that we might have somebody be the agenda, someone be the facilitator, somebody be the note keeper, like just to keep things running and to keep things moving along. In an ideal situation, I might imagine that the ILT would say, okay, if it's instructionally focused, we need to work on, whatever the issue might be, higher order thinking, questioning, some more student-centered learning. Maybe we want to do performance-based assessment, whatever it might be. And we might differentiate if we have depending on our school and its needs. And then we would task or give that work back to the PLCs. And as the ILT, I might think about, like, how do I make sure that the systems and structures of the school are actually facilitating teachers' ability to engage in that? For example, if I was going to transition to a performance-based assessment model, I might have to think about how we're going to deal with parents when we don't have grades anymore. So as the ILT, I would think that would be a great place to find resources, create a plan, do community outreach, think about the holding environment to ensure that when there's parent night, every teacher doesn't have to deal with angry parents who are wondering, how come their A student now has a P? or M for meets expectations. Meanwhile, you could also be sending resources to the PLCs to think about how to build rubrics. Like, what would the assessments look like? What are the standards that we hold together? Are we thinking about everybody bringing in, let's say, different student work and talking about what's working and what's not working in terms of would we all assess this the same way? If it were a vertical team, do the second grade, are those skill sets building enough to meet the third grade, or the third grade building the fourth? So you can imagine a bunch of activities that could facilitate a school-wide approach that made logical sense rather than lots of individual units doing the thing that they're doing week to week or month to month that sort of connect each other because we're all in a school, but may not actually be connecting to each other in terms of getting your biggest bang for buck for moving forward in terms of improvement. Or that different teams could talk to each other and actually have some cogent conversation about, we're working on something similar or related to, and there's something for us to learn from the fifth grade team or the math team versus the science team or social studies versus whomever.
Yeah, so there's coherency, which leads me to your book, The Strategy Playbook for Educational Leaders. So good.
Thank you for that plug. Thank you.
Well, it provides leaders with critical attributes for continuous improvement and for planning. These attributes are equity, logic, capacity, and coherence. So I think you have been speaking about these, but can you be very direct in talking about these 4 attributes as a consultant coming in and working with a school or working with a school and maybe developing an ILT, let's say? How would you go about supporting them in terms of these 4 attributes?
I think it's probably important to say what was the impetus for the book too, because I think that sort of situates it. So I was asked to look at so we have something called alliance districts, which are chronically underperforming, I would argue, most under-resourced districts in Connecticut. And as contingent on them receiving additional funding, what I might call just enough funding, I don't know if it's additional, a normal amount of funding, they had to create plans, district-wide plans for improvement. And I think many people have to create plans, whether they be your school improvement plan, your district plan. And speaking to many people and working in schools for as long as I have, there are very few people who think those plans are worth their time. And having read them, I could understand why. Again, it's not because the intent for improvement isn't there. I think we have never really made clear the purpose or function of these plans. Like, planning is important, but what is the schema, the operating schema that would help me make a good plan from a bad one or less useful one or whatever? What I noticed was that many of these plans were lacking components that you just mentioned. So I think that's really important. So number 1, equity as a guiding framework. And I think that's probably more critical now than ever, although it's always been important. And I would suggest that understanding and differentiating between issues of equality and equity are important, and thinking really about systems. So it's all well and good, for example, if you had a tracking system and you detract, but if it's really hard for certain kids to access the classes, or you end up only having special education resources associated with a particular group of kids, then you basically have retracked them in an untracked system. If their schedule based on a particular supplementary resource precludes them from being spread across all the math classes during the day, then you would have a concentration of kids with more needs being together throughout the day, which is just retracking. So you have to think about those kinds of systems. In terms of logic, one of the issues that I've noticed when I talk to people is there's a big emphasis on what we're going to do to change students and not enough attention paid to adult learning and development over time. So I call that the black box, right? Like, we would buy this curriculum or we would buy this kind of program, and then the students would have the outcomes we want, which just presumes that teachers are empty vessels and that all adults need is new information to be able to do things better. So we would never say to a student, or I guess some people would, but we would be mad at them, I gave them this new book and they didn't learn it, like, shame on them. But we do that to adults all the time. I offered this PD and they're not doing this. Or, I told them that they have to do online classes, but they don't do it. But adults also need to learn things, and we need to articulate, if we expect change on the outcome, we have to expect change across a trajectory. So the idea with the logic is that you have to say, okay, I'm going to teach it. Fine. Did they learn anything? If they didn't learn anything, what else do I have to do to support that? Did I change their belief system? Are they starting to implement? Okay, they're starting to implement. Like, how do I know that? And so on and so forth. Coherence is that what I was talking to you about in terms of even the teams. The coherence is the idea that like we're all working in concert with each other. I can't tell you how often there'll be a plan that's a 5-year plan, but then the school or the district has to hand in a plan the next year and they're totally different initiatives. Or the initiatives don't speak to one another. Oftentimes that means if you're going to be coherent, you're probably going to have to do fewer things. And then capacity is the idea that if you want people to do something different, I go into systems with the assumption that everyone is working as hard as they can. And the reason things aren't working well is because if they knew how, they would do it, but they don't, or they don't have the resources to make it work. So if that's your orientation, then you have to attend to looking at what actual capacity you have today. And if you want it to be more than what you have today, you have to put resources in to build it. I think with COVID, this is a great example. I want people to all go on to full remote learning. But I talk to districts where, I mean, this is a capacity issue. They literally don't have internet. Like people don't have internet, or they don't have internet service, or not every child has a laptop, or not all the teachers have been trained in that. So the idea that I would just say, I'll flip a switch and everybody can just go about their business and do it feels to me not in keeping with reality. So the idea is to really try to center these ideas of learning, development, capacity, equity in how we're thinking about change, not an idea of change that's just like, if I will them to do it, they'll do it.
Do you go about this approach with an initiative audit? What's our current reality? Where do we want to get to? And let's look at the processes that we have in place that'll get us there.
Yeah, and I think so portrait of graduate kind of delineates or moves the needle in the sense of like where we backward design, where do you want to try to get to? Simultaneously, absolutely. I think one of the things is there's often so much going on because there's been years and years of this kind of incoherent or additional kind of intervention orientation. I mean, there's just fatigue. And I think oftentimes people don't stop doing some things. So sometimes a good plan includes stopping doing things. I think there's a famous saying, like, if you have 10 priorities, you have none.
Yeah, yes.
But I don't think schools and school systems are really good at saying we actually have to cut back and just do one or two things well. And again, that's because the incentive structure has not been aligned with that.
So considering the constraints that schools experience that you've talked a little bit about, the mindsets that exist, what's the first step that they could do to really start to move the needle on teaching and learning under their level of influence?
It's a great question. I think I might read Hackman's book, to be honest.
Jennie here is referring to Richard Hackman's book, Leading Teams, Setting the Stage for Great Performances.
And think about the ways in which I could, under my purview, ensure that the teams, if I was thinking about grade level teams, had what they needed to really, I wouldn't even think system-wide. How am I going to buffer these teams, create some conditions that they have everything they need to be successful? So that includes coaching and consulting when they need it, the resources and all the information from the front end to do whatever tasks they're set out to do, ensuring that they have a clear sense of purpose, knowledge, it's narrowly focused, that there's meeting time set aside, the room is nice, help them set norms for how they're going to behave, roles and responsibilities. And I think I would try to launch those teams as functionally as I could. And then I would try to go around and serve as a coach for those teams aligned with what best practice is. And there's other things about how people should coach teams at what part of the life cycle a team is in. And then I would try to use those as small pockets of modeling to support that going to scale over time. But I think I would see my role as what I might call a boundary spanner, sitting between the system of the school and these teams and trying to create a buffer zone and space to facilitate little pockets of really excellent practice, almost as labs and models for others to come and see. and hear how those teams are evolving and can do this work if we give them the resources and conditions they need to be successful. So I think I would think about it more like that.
So here I asked Jennie to speak a little bit more about this role of the boundary spanner.
You can buffer. So they do bridging and buffering. Bridging would be to go to the principal and say, listen, I read this amazing book. I have this idea about how we're running PLCs. Would you be willing to try this? Can I have these 4 or 5 resources to ensure they have what they need? That would be the bridging, and feeding back information. It's going great, or making sure they have the information that they need. And then there's buffering, which is like, I'm protecting. So the principal comes to me and says, listen, I really need the grade level to give me their test scores for the report for the district tomorrow. And I would say, I totally hear you. I hear that that's a priority. Can you give me 24 hours? Because they have their meeting, and I'd hate to take that meeting time from them because we've worked so hard to cultivate it, and they have an agenda and they're making decisions about particular things. Is there any way you could put the district off for 10 hours and I'll work with them to make sure you get what you need? And that would be a buffering activity, because I protected the sanctity of the team from this sort of disruption that's necessary, but could throw off all the hard work that we're doing to make the team function effectively.
Thank you for clarifying that and giving such a clear example. You do that so well. You've done it throughout the book. That's why I love it so much. Dr. Jennie Weiner, thank you so much.
This is so fun. My whole purpose is to help make schools better, and for people who are in those systems feel like I'm offering something of use.
Where can listeners find you, Jennie?
They can find me at UConn, jennie.weiner@uconn.edu. I am on Twitter at Jennie Weiner, and I'm going to have my own website soon too. So I think it'll be called drjennieweiner.com, but that's coming soon. There's nothing that brings me greater joy than practitioners telling me how I got things right or wrong, or need to think about other things. It's why I'm in the work. So
that was my interview with Dr. Jennie Weiner. Now I'd like to leave you with another free tool to support you with your leadership as you're supporting professional learning teams. So if you go to my website, johnwilliscoaching.com/tools, you'll find a free collaborative learning team assessment. This can help you get a snapshot of how the team's actions and conversations reflect their current level of collaboration during any given meeting. Likewise, the team members themselves can take the assessment to reflect on and engage in level setting around the team's collaboration. So this is a free assessment based on 4 domains: team structure, team accountability, team norms, and continuous quality improvement. I also provide you with a protocol you can use with your team for that goal setting. So go to johnwilliscoaching.com/tools to get your free collaborative learning team assessment now. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember, your leadership actions make a difference. What are you committed to this week? I'm John Willis, and you've been listening to The Teaming Edge.